Okay, so the reason that I decided to write this blog post was because this was actually something that I struggled with making happen, and I spent lots of research on the Googles to figure out how other people have done this. The reason why I knew it was somewhat possible was the inspiration I got from Lullabot and what he did for the Twit network, which is he created something they called Skype-O-Saurus, so I just called mine Skype-O-Saurus. But what he did was he used multiple pieces of hardware and a mixing console and lots of other things to achieve what I was trying to do. So when it comes to building my Skype-O-Saurus, why I wanted to do this was because when we record our podcasts, we generally have multiple guests and a host. And it's great. But the problem is with multiple guests, we use Skype and Audio Hijack. And Audio Hijack, when it records the conversation that you're having with your guests, it does put the host on one audio channel and it puts the guests on another audio channel. The problem with this is you have multiple guests, and if one of them is talking and another one in the background, let's say dogs bark, well, that's just there. And because these are guests, they're friends, they're people in the Drupal community, they're not paid people to be on your podcast, and you can't interrupt them in the middle of their conversation and say, "Excuse me, someone's dog just barked. Could you say that again?" So I wanted a way to make that I could take that dog bark out without wrecking the flow of the podcast. And the only way to do that is if every guest you have on your podcast is recorded to an audio file all of its own. That way, during the podcast, if that dog barks in the editing workflow, I just remove the dog bark and the person just continues to keep talking. So I did some research, and there's something out there called Soundflower that I've always known existed during all this. It's actually kind of an older piece of software. It's now maintained by Rogue Amoeba. I don't even know if it's maintained. I know that's where we can get it. Soundflower is the first part that helped me get going on this. What Soundflower does is basically makes your computer an audio board. So I'm taking software and I'm removing the piece of hardware that I don't have and can't afford to buy. So Soundflower is going to allow me to basically make so my computer has lots of different ins and outs. But I still couldn't figure out how I wanted to make this work because I needed multiple ins and outs. I also needed to make so each Skype was its own instance, and that's when I also came across a program called Multi-Skype Launcher. This is on the Mac. I think there's a Windows version of some kind as well. This allows me to just launch multiple instances of Skype, each have them log in to a different account, and then I have each guest call one of those different accounts. So now here's the next part. With Soundflower, I was like, okay, so how do I get everyone to hear each other? How do I make so they all record? I found this article that pretty much gave me my aha moment, where they basically did this, but they used audio recording software called Ableton Live. First of all, I'm not very familiar with this software, and second of all, I believe it's a lot more expensive than the route I chose to go with, which was Logic Pro X. But I basically did the same thing they did. They basically made this great drawing. It was almost like someone drew on a napkin. But as you can see here, multiple instances of Skype using Soundflower. You have multiple ins and outs, and you route all of those Soundflowers, and I route them through Logic. And then Logic just records each Skype as a separate audio track. But I was still trying to figure out how I'm not sure. But what was great is this website here actually gave you a custom Soundflower instance that made so Soundflower basically gives you Soundflower and Soundflower 64 channel. But I need channels actually broken out so I could plug them in and out of Skype. And that's exactly what it gave me. Now, there's another part of this that makes this possible is Apple has the ability to build sound devices that not a lot of people know about. And it's actually an audio MIDI program. I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. This is actually called Apple's Audio MIDI Setup. It's a program on your computer. You can launch it. And what you can do is down in the lower left is you can create what is called a device or an aggregate device. And I created a device for our podcast called Drupalize.Me. And we'll go ahead and take a look at what that looks like here. And basically then I added, because of that custom Soundflower instance I have, we have a Soundflower 2-channel A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I. I added all of those to my Drupalize.Me. I also then added my microphone and my outputs. Now you can see now that each one of these is all given channel names and channel numbers, and you're going to need to know which one is which when we're inside Logic. Because I'm going to show you how we can make Logic now use all of these and then we'll use sends to feed to people. One thing to understand that I didn't really know about when I was first doing this, these are actually able to be sorted, so you can drag them just to get everything in order. So I wanted it to be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, then my mic, then output. So bear with me. Let's get to Logic to see how this goes about. So here we are in Logic, and we're looking at Logic's mixer board. So now with Soundflower and Logic, I have an actual mixer. It's not hardware, it's a software mixer. And inside Logic, the first thing I had to do is I actually had to tell Logic to go, let's bring its preferences up. Inside Logic, you have an audio and you choose your devices. So input device and output device. So I wanted to make sure that I chose my device that I created in the audio MIDI setup with Drupalize.Me as my input and my output, because that basically contains everything that I have. So now when that's done, what you're able to do is I created all my channels for each person. We have my microphone, then we have each Skype caller right here. The other ones are created as you start to create sends and all that in Logic, not really part of this demonstration. But the beautiful thing is, now in my inputs, so for bot 1, my inputs, I'm able to go to input and choose 1, 2. That is actually coming from my Drupalize.Me that I set up in the audio MIDI. So now that's the input 1, 2. So what does that mean? Let me bring up Skype's preferences and I'll show you how this works. So basically then what can happen here is in Skype, between the microphone and the speakers, I'm going to use those A, B, C, Ds, and Es that I have from Soundflower. Soundflower is basically the app that's now making all of those as options for audio inputs and outputs to other devices. So for example, I can bring in here and I did it so they were kind of in reversed. So microphone is B, speakers are A. And then in Logic, that's input 1, 2. Now let's go back to the MIDI setup so this makes more sense. If you look up here, A and B are input channels 1 and 2 and output channels 1 and 2. Soundflower B, input 3 and 4, output 3 and 4. You can use them as inputs or outputs. So basically I'm going to use sound A as output and sound B as input. So then when I have that set up here in Logic, I've got this basically as the Skype for that particular person. And now what I have to do though is, this is kind of audio engineering, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but you have what is called a send. So then what I can do is I can actually send this particular Skype instance audio to the rest of them. That's where these are all coming in. So basically I send it to bus 2, 3, 4, and 5, which is actually just bot 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then what happens is I have actual individual volume controls to send to these people. So let's say bot 5 is telling me he can barely hear bot 1, but bot 2 says it's just fine. I can actually adjust the individual volumes going to each different person. So that's how I set this up. Then what's great is when you record, every single one of these Skype instances is being recorded as a separate audio channel along with my microphone. And then I just edit them. Let's see what it looks like to have those audio files. So then basically, as you can see here, everybody's on their own track. I just try not to bump them because you don't want them to be out of sync. I don't want to lock sync. I could lock sync, which I do sometimes as I'm working. And now that everybody is in here, you can see everybody's audio files when they're talking. Let's say like this right here, maybe that was a dog bark. Then I could just remove that piece of audio and everybody else doesn't have to hear it in the final output of the podcast. So this is what I called my Skype-O-Saurus. Modified the name just so Leo doesn't get upset about it. But it was just an easier way to make so I can edit our podcasts with a cleaner output so people don't have to deal with this stuff and I don't have to bother my guests to record audio on their own end and send it to me, or we could do this on other pieces of software that they may have to install. Skype is pretty much out there. We stick with it, and this just made now that we can use Skype and get the end product that I needed as our audio editor.